Hi. Here is the PowerMac G4. The PowerMac G4 was a series of personal computers that was designed, manufactured, and sold by Apple between 1999 and 2004. They used the PowerPC G4, PPC-74XX series of microprocessors. They were heralded by Apple to be the first personal supercomputers, reaching speeds of 4 to 20 gigaflops. It was both the last Macintosh to boot natively into classic Mac OS and the first to boot exclusively into Mac OS X. The original Apple PowerMac G4, code-name Yikes, was introduced at the CIO conference in San Francisco on August 31, 1999, one with 400 MHz, 450 MHz and 500 MHz configurations available. In October 1999, Apple was forced to postpone the 500 MHz because of poor yield of the 500 MHz chips. In response, Apple speed-dumped the processor speed in each configuration by 50 MHz but caused some controversy by not decreasing the price of the machines. The early 400 MHz, later 350 MHz PCI-based version used a motherboard identical to the one used in Power Macintosh G3, blue and white computers, minus the 8 dB port, in a graphite color case and with the new Motorola PowerPC 7400 G4 CPU. The higher speed models, code-name Sawtooth, used a greatly modified motherboard design with a GP2X graphics, replacing the 66 MHz PCI slot. In December 1999, the entire PowerMac G4 line was updated to the AGP motherboard. The machines featured DVB-ROM drives as standard. The 400 MHz and 450 MHz versions had 100 MB zip drives as standard equipment, and as an option on the 350 MHz Sawtooth. This series had a 100 MHz system bus and 4 PC100 SD-RAM slots for up to 2 GB of RAM, 1.5 GB under Mac OS 9. The 8GB PowerMacs were the first to include an airport slot and DVI video port. The 500 MHz version was reintroduced on February 16, 2000, accompanied by 400 MHz and 450 MHz models. DVD-RAM and zip drives featured on these later 450 MHz and 500 MHz versions and were an option on the 400 MHz. Apple's marketing name for all these early AGP models is PowerMac AGP Graphics. The codename Sawtooth was used internally before release and became the popular designation among enthusiasts. The design was updated at the Macworld Expo New York on July 19, 2000. The new revision included dual-processor 450 MHz and 500 MHz versions, and a low-end single CPU 400 MHz model. It was also the first personal computer to include Gigabit Ethernet as standard. Most people saw this revision as a stopgap release, because higher clock G4s were not available. The G4's Motorola XPC107 Grackle PCI memory controller prevented the G4 from hitting speeds higher than 500 MHz. The dual 500 MHz models featured DVD-RAM optical drive. Zip drives were optional on all models. These models also introduced Apple's proprietary Apple Display Connector video port. This particular machine has a dual processor 450 MHz, 640 MB of RAM. Now this machine will boot up on Mac OS X Tiger. Mac OS X 10.4 Tiger is the fifth major release of Mac OS X, Apple's desktop and server operating system for Macintosh computers. Tiger was released to the public on the 29th of April 2005 for US $129.95 as the successor to Mac OS X Panther, version 10.3, which had been released 18 months earlier. Tiger was succeeded by Mac OS X 10.5 Leopard on the 26th of October 2007, after 30 months, making Tiger the longest-running version of Mac OS X. Some of the new features include a fast searching system called Spotlight, a new version of the Safari web browser, dashboard, a new unified theme, and improved support for 64-bit addressing on PowerMac G5s. Tiger was included with all new Macintosh computers, and was also available as an upgrade for existing Mac OS X users, or users of supported pre-Mac OS X systems. The Server Edition, Mac OS X Server 10.4, was also available for some Macintosh product lines. Tiger is also the first version of any released Apple operating system to work on Apple Intel architecture machines, Apple machines using x86 processors. The Apple TV, as released in March 2007, ships with a customized version of Mac OS X Tiger branded Apple TV OS that replaces the usual graphical user interface with an updated version of Front Row. 6 weeks after its official release, Apple had delivered 2 million copies of Tiger, representing 16% of all Mac OS X users. Apple claimed that Tiger was the most successful Apple OS release in the company's history. At the Worldwide Developers Conference on June 11, 2007, Apple's previous CEO Steve Jobs announced that out of the 22 million Mac OS X users, more than 67% were using Tiger. Tiger is the last version of Mac OS X to support the Mac OS 9 compatibility layer called Classic Environment. However, Classic Environment will not work on Intel Macs. The last security update released for Tiger users was the 2009-005 update. The next security update, 2009-006, only included support for Leopard and Snow Leopard. The latest version of QuickTime is 7.6.4. The last version of iTunes that can run on Tiger is 9.2.1, because 10.0 only supports Mac OS X Leopard and later. Safari 4.1.3 is the final version for Tiger as of the 18th of November 2010. Despite not having received security updates since then, Tiger remains popular with PowerMac users and retro computing enthusiasts due to its wide software and hardware compatibility, as it runs on a wide variety of older machines and still supports most classic macOS applications. Now you will see the Classic Environment. Classic, or Classic Environment, is a hardware and software abstraction layer in early versions of Mac OS X that allows applications compatible with Mac OS 9 to run on the Mac OS X operating system. The name Classic is also sometimes used by software vendors to refer to the application programming interface available to classic applications, to differentiate between programming for Mac OS X and the previous version of the Mac OS. Classic is supported on PowerPC-based Macs running versions of Mac OS X up to 10.4 Tiger, but is not supported on 10.5 Leopard and later, nor on Intel-based Macs running any version of Mac OS X. The Classic environment provides a way to run classic applications on Apple's G5 systems as well as on most G4-based computers sold after September 2002. These machines cannot boot Mac OS 9 or earlier without the bridging capabilities of Classic or other software. Classic is not supported on versions of Mac OS X that run on Apple systems incorporating Intel microprocessors, which includes all new shipping Apple computers, as of September 2006. The last version of macOS to support Classic on PowerPCs was macOS X 10.4 Tiger. Hope that you enjoyed this brief presentation about the PowerMac G4. I will be posting other similar videos. If you have any suggestions, please drop me a note. You may subscribe to this channel so you do not miss any future presentations. Have a nice day.